What's going on, everybody? Kalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Motorola Moto G Power 2021 and going over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy in 2022. Now, this phone's successor, the Motorola Moto G Power 2022, actually came out pretty recently, so it definitely comes into question whether or not this phone is actually still worth it. So we're going to take a look at this phone and see what kind of value it still offers. Now, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps out the channel a lot. And for your convenience, I have included the link to this phone in the video description, so be sure to check out that link to see the latest info on pricing and availability, because this is always changing. But with all that being said, let's get started. So this phone has a 6.6-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 266, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and a screen-to-body ratio of about 83.8%. So in pretty much every way, this is a really standard type of display for an entry-level phone. Usually they have some sort of LCD display, 720p resolution, nothing really special here, but I will say it does look pretty nice. The bezels are decently thin. The image in general, despite only being 720p, is pretty sharp, so I can definitely appreciate that. And overall, the screen is pretty bright, especially compared to some other phones in this price range, where you can have the brightness at 100% and it's still kind of hard to see. With this phone, you're not going to have any trouble seeing this display, no matter what type of lighting you're in. Now for the front-facing camera, we got a hole punch right up here off to the side, and this camera is 8 megapixels. Now it's interesting because they actually moved this hole punch with the Moto G Power 2022. On that phone, it's actually right here in the middle. I don't really think it makes that much of a difference. Maybe the appearance looks a little bit cleaner, but functionally it's basically the same. I will be doing a comparison between this phone and the Moto G Power 2022 in the future, so if you want to see that, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Now for storage, this phone is getting 32 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion. Now there are other variants of this phone that have 64 gigabytes, but this specific phone in my hand only has 32. Now that is pretty unfortunate, because 32 gigabytes of internal storage really isn't very much. Even for the average user, you're going to go through that pretty quickly. So I definitely recommend getting a microSD card if you happen to have this variant. Now with 64 gigabytes, it's definitely a lot more acceptable, and in this day and age, with things like apps in the system and just data in general getting larger and larger, 64 gigabytes really feels like a minimum to me. Now it's interesting to note that with the Moto G Power 2022, as far as I know, there is no 32 gigabyte variant. There's only the 64 gigabyte version, so that's one change I really like, but more on that in the comparison. Now this phone does not have wireless charging, not a big surprise. I want to say most phones in this price range don't, although more and more finally are getting it. I still don't really consider it an expectation unless we're talking about flagship phones. For security options, we got both face unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key. Real convenient, because if you're going to be pressing the power key to wake up the display anyway, being able to unlock it at the same time is always nice. So let's give the fingerprint scanner a try and see how well it works. There we go, one more time. And there we go. As you can see, it's real fast and responsive, and I will say the button feels really solid. There are lots of phones with fingerprint scanners on the power key where the button just feels kind of flimsy, but this one feels real nice and sturdy, definitely real high quality. Now taking a look at the phone's rear camera setup here, we got a triple camera with a 48 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera for portrait mode. So this is a pretty decent camera setup. I am a little disappointed there's no ultra wide camera. I don't know why they took that feature away, because the Moto G Power 2020 actually had one, but all the same, unfortunately with the 2022 model of this phone, they didn't bring it back. So as to whether or not having an ultra wide camera affects how worth it this phone is in 2022, it doesn't really change things that much, although I will say there are plenty of phones in this price range that actually do have ultra wide cameras. So while I don't personally consider it that much of a make or break with this phone, if having an ultra wide camera is important to you, there are plenty of other options out there. To give you an idea of what this phone's camera can do, this is a photo taken with the rear camera of the phone. This was taken during a sunset, and I will say it captured the colors really well. It's decently bright too, although I will say compared to some other phones I've also used in this price range, I have seen other phones that take brighter pictures, so keep that in mind. But for what it is, I do think it's really good. This is a photo taken with portrait mode. I was especially impressed by this because the background is blended really well with the subject. Now, portrait mode is usually meant to take photos of people, and obviously this doesn't really fit that description, but all the same, I do think it did a really good job for what it is. So overall, I do think this camera setup is pretty nice. If you're going to be taking photos for social media or something like that, I definitely think you're going to be able to get some nice shots with this. My only complaint is, once again, there's no ultra wide camera. That is such a common feature that I'm really starting to expect more and more, even in entry level phones. But other than that, I do think it's pretty good. Now for video, we got a max quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so no 4K or anything like that, but I really don't expect it from a phone in this price range, so it's no big deal. Now internally, this phone is getting 3GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 662 processor. I ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 306 and a multi-core score of 1370. So this is actually really impressive, especially for a phone in this price range, and not only just the price range, but this phone is a year old, which I feel like for a smartphone isn't exactly old, but it's definitely not new either, since there is a successor out and all that. And as you're gonna see in the comparison between the two, this phone actually has more processing power than its successor. So that is pretty impressive. Now independently, Geekbench 5 scores don't really mean a whole lot by themselves. You really need something to compare them to, so what I recommend is running a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on your current device and comparing the scores to this one to see whether or not this phone would be an upgrade. Now with that being said, personally, as I've used this phone, I haven't experienced any performance issues. I've actually been doing some gaming on this, just testing out some different graphics heavy activities to see how well it runs. Now if you want to see a full gaming test on this phone, definitely let me know in the comments because I'd be happy to make one. But in general, as far as processing power goes, while this phone is definitely not going to be anything close to a flagship phone or anything like that, I do think this processor really does hold its own, and for regular use, it does run really well. Now for the battery, this phone, as always, has a really impressive battery with a 5000 mAh battery. This supports 15-watt fast charging, so that's going to give you a ton of battery life throughout the day. And in terms of longevity, since the battery is so much larger, it's going to take longer for the degradation to really catch up and kill the battery life. So if you like to get one phone and keep it for a long period of time, this is definitely going to be a great option for that. And of course, the 15-watt fast charging doesn't hurt either. Who doesn't like to charge up their phone faster? So if you do have a powerful fast charger, I'd say it works pretty well with this phone. Now unfortunately, this phone doesn't have NFC, and its successor doesn't either. I really wonder when Motorola is going to start putting NFC in phones. In my opinion, it's becoming more and more relevant. In case you don't know what it is, NFC is the technology behind contactless mobile payment services like Google Pay, and using that kind of thing is becoming more and more popular, so I really don't get why these phones don't have NFC. It's not that complicated of a feature because there are plenty of other phones out there, even in this price range, that have it. But now that we've gone over some of the specs of the phone, let's take a closer look at the device itself. On the left-hand side here, we don't have a whole lot going on, just the slot for the SIM card and the microSD card. On the bottom here, we got the microphone, a USB-C port, and the speaker. On the right side, we got the power key and the volume keys, and remember, this is the fingerprint scanner as well, and the buttons are really nice and sturdy. On the top here, we got a 3.5mm headphone jack, and the noise cancelling microphone. On the back, we got our camera setup and our flash, and there's a Motorola logo right here. The back has an interesting texture. I don't even know what to call this. It's like wavy or something like that, and it really doesn't pick up fingerprints too badly. You can hardly see them even in this light, and I will say there are lots of fingerprints on this phone right now, so that just goes to show how nice this texture and color really is. Overall, the phone doesn't really feel premium per se, except the buttons. I will say the buttons actually do feel kind of premium, but the rest of it really doesn't. It's made with plastic all around, except for the glass screen, of course. But with that being said, it does have some weight to it, and it feels really high quality, so it definitely doesn't feel cheap at all. And with the thin bezels and hole punch camera, it does have a nice modern look to it. So in conclusion, is the Motorola Moto G Power 2021 still worth buying in 2022? I would say it absolutely is. The only real legitimate complaints I have about this phone are the fact that it doesn't have an ultra-wide camera and the storage. Everything else is pretty much exactly what I would expect out of a phone in this price range. It's definitely not the best phone in the world, it doesn't have the fastest processor out there, and it doesn't take DSLR quality photos or anything like that. If you compare it to a flagship phone, it's of course not going to be near that level, but at the same time, for an entry-level phone, it pretty much does everything you could possibly expect. It has a really nice looking display that's really bright, has a good form factor, it's not too big, not too small, a good thin design to go along with that so it's not uncomfortable to hold in your hand or carry in your pocket. It has both face unlock and a fingerprint scanner, and the fingerprint scanner is located in a nice spot. It has a good camera setup that can take nice pictures for social media or whatever you want, albeit it doesn't have an ultra wide camera. Again, I am still pretty disappointed about that, especially considering the older version of this phone did have one. It also has a good processor and a really nice battery. So overall, if you're looking for a fast entry-level phone to use for stuff like web browsing, social media, streaming videos and general content consumption, and maybe some light gaming, then the Motorola Moto G Power 2021 is still going to be a great option in 2022. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And once again, I have included the link to this phone in the video description, so be sure to check out that link for the latest info on pricing and availability, because that does change from time to time. But that's it for this one. I will see you next time.